Picture this. You're standing in the muddy streets of London in 1441 when you hear the commotion approaching. Angry voices, the clatter of iron chains, and above it all, the desperate sobbing of a woman. Through the crowd, you see her being dragged by armed guards, her dress torn, mud streaking her face, blood trickling from where someone threw a stone. But this isn't just any woman. This is Eleanor Cobb, Duchess of Gloucester, a woman who once commanded castles and armies, now reduced to a broken animal being paraded through filthy streets. Children are encouraged to throw refuse at her while their parents cheer, learning early what happens to women who dare challenge male authority. But the guards deliberately chose the busiest market day, ensuring maximum humiliation as hundreds of witnesses see a once powerful woman reduced to less than livestock. Her public degradation was carefully orchestrated theatre. But it was just the appetizer. What happened to women behind medieval prison walls makes modern horror movies look like children's fairy tales. These weren't just punishments, they were systematic destruction of the female soul through methods so brutal that most historical records refuse to describe them in detail, instead using euphemisms like appropriate correction or moral instruction to disguise unspeakable cruelty. You think you know about medieval torture? You know absolutely nothing. The popular image of medieval justice focuses on male prisoners in dramatic dungeons, but the reality for women was far worse because their punishment was specifically designed to target feminine identity, reproductive function, and psychological vulnerability in ways that male torture never approached. Today I'm revealing 7 unspeakable punishments specifically designed to destroy women, and what you're about to discover will haunt you forever because it reveals how entire civilizations can systematically brutalize half their population while maintaining religious righteousness and legal legitimacy. The horror began the moment a woman stepped into prison with what they euphemistically called the intake ritual, but what was actually systematic dehumanization, disguised as security procedure designed to break spirits before any formal punishment began. This process was standardized across medieval Europe, refined through generations of practice until authorities understood exactly how to destroy feminine dignity most efficiently. Agnes Hancock, a merchant's wife accused of adultery in 1468, experienced this nightmare firsthand when she was dragged from her comfortable home to Newgate Prison in London. Guards didn't just search her, they systematically destroyed every shred of dignity she possessed through carefully choreographed humiliation that served no security purpose whatsoever. First, they stripped her completely naked in front of male guards and other prisoners, forcing her into degrading positions while making crude comments about what they planned to do to her later, describing in explicit detail how her body would be used as entertainment for guards and visiting customers. This wasn't about finding hidden weapons, this was about establishing absolute power over her body and soul, while making it clear that she no longer possessed any human rights or dignity. The psychological impact was devastating because Agnes had spent her entire life in respectable society where her body was her own property, protected by marriage and social status that evaporated the moment she entered prison. But here's the most psychologically devastating part. They forced her to thank them for their treatment, to express gratitude for being allowed to live, and to beg for basic necessities like water or a place to sleep, creating cognitive dissonance that helped break down psychological resistance by making her complicit in her own degradation. Cells were positioned to allow sounds to travel in specific ways that maximized terror and isolation, with women able to hear the screams and suffering of other prisoners, but unable to communicate with them or determine exactly where the sounds were coming from, creating constant awareness of pain without any possibility of human connection or mutual support. Stone construction amplified certain sounds while muffling others, creating an acoustic environment where approaching footsteps echoed ominously throughout the structure, while conversations remained impossible, making every sound potentially threatening. while preventing the formation of relationships that might provide psychological comfort. The sound of keys clanking, doors slamming, and chains rattling became constant background noise that kept prisoners in states of heightened anxiety, never knowing when death might be walking toward their door or when their own screams might join the chorus of suffering that filled these architectural nightmares designed specifically to destroy the human spirit through environmental manipulation alone. Perhaps the most sadistic invention in human history was the ducking chair, a device that transformed potential murder into public entertainment while maintaining the legal fiction that deaths were accidental rather than intentional executions designed to terrorize the female population. This wasn't just punishment. It was spectacle carefully designed to satisfy bloodthirsty crowds while maintaining the pretense of legal procedure and moral righteousness that allowed communities to participate in murder while feeling virtuous about upholding justice. The ducking chair represented the perfect intersection of misogyny, sadism, and crowd psychology, transforming the systematic oppression of women into community festivals that brought entire towns together in celebration of female suffering. Margot of York experienced this horror in 1455 after being accused of gossiping about the local lord's wife, a charge that modern legal systems would recognize as completely baseless, but which medieval law treated as serious criminal behavior, deserving public punishment and potential death. The preparation for her ducking was as psychologically devastating as the event itself, with town criers announcing the spectacle days in advance to ensure maximum attendance while vendors prepared food stalls and entertainment that would transform her potential death into a profitable community. So, celebration. They stripped her naked in the town square, while crowds gathered to examine her body and make crude comments about her physical attributes, turning her into an object for public consumption before the torture even began. She was then strapped to a wooden chair, attached to a long pole, with the binding deliberately tight enough to cut off circulation and cause additional pain while preventing any possibility of escape or resistance that might spoil the crowd's entertainment. The ducking process was choreographed for maximum humiliation and suspense, with operators deliberately controlling the pace to build crowd excitement while maximizing Margot's psychological terror through unpredictable timing that made each submersion potentially her last. The chair was lowered slowly into the river while crowds cheered and placed bets on her survival, with some spectators throwing additional stones or refused to increase her suffering, while others shouted encouragement for the operators to hold her under longer. But here's what makes this truly horrific: the duration of submersion was left entirely to the operator's whim and crowd response, creating uncertainty about whether each ducking would be the last, while turning murder into audience participation entertainment, where crowd enthusiasm could determine whether a woman lived or died. Many women drowned during this process, their deaths celebrated by crowds who viewed female mortality as fitting punishment for stepping outside prescribed social roles. But authorities maintained legal deniability by claiming these were accidents rather than executions, allowing communities to murder women while maintaining their moral self-perception as righteous upholders of divine law. The crowds would cheer when she went under and explode in excitement if she failed to surface, treating human death as entertainment while teaching children that female suffering was not only acceptable but worthy of celebration. Margot survived her ducking, but the psychological trauma was so severe that she never spoke again, spending her remaining years in catatonic silence that served as a living warning to other women about what awaited those who dared challenge male authority or social norms through something as simple conversation. For women who dared to speak their minds, criticize authority, or engage in any verbal behavior deemed inappropriate for their gender, medieval authorities created the scold's bridle, an iron cage of pure evil designed to destroy the female voice forever, while serving as a visible symbol of patriarchal control over feminine expression. This device represented sophisticated understanding of how to target specifically feminine forms of power and resistance, recognizing that women often wielded influence through speech rather than physical force, and developing torture specifically designed to eliminate this threat to male dominance. The scold's bridle looked around a woman's head like a metal cage and contained metal spikes positioned to pierce her tongue if she attempted to speak. But the true horror lay not in the immediate pain, but in the long-term psychological and physical destruction it caused through prolonged use that could extend for weeks or months depending on the severity of her verbal crimes against masculine authority. The device was designed with multiple torture elements that work together to create maximum suffering while maintaining the pretense of moral correction rather than sadistic entertainment, with the metal cage preventing the woman from eating properly, drinking safely, or sleeping comfortably, while the tongue spikes made any attempt at speech an exercise in self-inflicted agony. Mary Fletcher discovered this horror in 1472 after making the mistake of criticizing her local priest's corruption and financial exploitation of parish members, verbal behavior that was perfectly accurate but legally defined as criminal when performed by a woman challenging male religious authority. And for 21 consecutive days, she wore the scold's bridle while being paraded through town as a living example of what happened to women who forgot their proper place in the social hierarchy. The psychological torture was as devastating as the physical pain because she was forced to watch her family and friends look away in shame and fear, while strangers mocked her condition and praised the wisdom of authorities who had silenced her dangerous feminine voice. The spikes gradually cut deeper into her tongue with each involuntary movement, each attempt to swallow saliva or consume the minimal water she was allowed, creating fresh wounds that became infected in the unsanitary conditions of medieval imprisonment. By the time they removed the device, her tongue was mutilated beyond repair, swollen and scarred to the point where coherent speech became impossible. Her voice forever reduced to unintelligible mumbles that served as permanent advertisement for the consequences of feminine verbal resistance. The message was crystal clear to every woman who witnessed her condition. Women who speak against authority will lose their voice forever, not just temporarily, but permanently, making their punishment a lifetime reminder of masculine power over feminine expression. The most twisted part was that they made her husband pay for the privilege of silencing his own wife, forcing him to become financially complicit in her torture while bankrupting the family through fees that continued accumulating throughout her imprisonment, ensuring that the economic consequences would affect multiple generations, while teaching him that challenging authority through his wife's behavior would destroy everything he had worked to build. Now we enter territory so dark that most history books refuse to acknowledge it even existed, where pregnant women in medieval prisons weren't just prisoners, but breeding commodities in a system that treated human reproduction as a profitable business opportunity, while systematically destroying maternal bonds and family structures through institutionalized human trafficking, disguised as criminal justice. This aspect of medieval imprisonment reveals how completely women's reproductive capacity was viewed as economic resource rather than personal autonomy, with pregnancy making women more valuable as commodities while simultaneously making them more vulnerable to exploitation and abuse designed to maximize profit from their reproductive function. The systematic nature of this exploitation demonstrates sophisticated understanding of human psychology and economics, with prison operators developing detailed procedures for managing pregnant prisoners that prioritized commercial value over human welfare while maintaining legal frameworks that made resistance or complaint impossible. Here's how this nightmare worked. Pregnant prisoners were deliberately kept past their original sentences till they gave birth, often through fabricated additional charges or administrative delays that had no legal basis but served economic purposes by ensuring that valuable reproductive resources remained available for commercial exploitation. Their children immediately became property of the prison system rather than their mothers, with no legal recognition of maternal rights or family bonds that might interfere with the profitable trafficking of newborn infants to wealthy customers seeking heirs or servants. These babies were then sold through sophisticated networks that connected prisons with wealthy families, religious institutions, and commercial enterprises seeking child labor. generating substantial revenue for prison operators while creating permanent separation between mothers and children that served both psychological and economic purposes by preventing family bonds that might motivate rescue attempts or resistance to authority. The pricing structure for these transactions reflected market economics, with healthy babies commanding higher prices than sick ones, male children worth more than females, and infants born to noble mothers representing premium commodities that wealthy families would pay extraordinary sums to acquire as legitimate heirs to their estates and titles. If mothers refused to cooperate with these arrangements or attempted to resist the sale of their children, they faced violence, specifically targeting their pregnancies through beatings focused on the abdomen, forced labor designed to cause miscarriage, and medical neglect that increased the likelihood of dangerous complications during pregnancy and delivery. Guards would chain pregnant women more heavily than other prisoners and force them to perform physical labor that was specifically chosen to endanger their pregnancies, while claiming that work was necessary for the health and moral improvement of criminal women who needed to learn proper feminine submission through productive activity. When these deliberately dangerous conditions caused miscarriages, the women were then charged with destroying valuable property and faced extended sentences as additional punishment for failing to successfully produce saleable children, from creating legal frameworks that made women responsible for pregnancy outcomes while denying them any control over the conditions that determined those outcomes. Isabella Worth experienced this horror in 1463 when she was imprisoned for allegedly stealing bread to feed her starving family and discovered she was pregnant shortly after her arrest, transforming her from a simple criminal into a valuable reproductive asset whose treatment would be determined by her commercial potential rather than her legal status or human dignity. She gave birth in a filthy cell with no medical attention whatsoever, surrounded by other prisoners and watched by guards who were interested only in determining whether the child would survive long enough to be sold, with no consideration for her pain, health, or emotional welfare during the traumatic delivery process. Her baby died within hours from infection and exposure caused by the deliberately unsanitary conditions that prison authorities maintained to reduce costs while maximizing profits. But the guards forced her to carry the decomposing corpse for 8 full days before official removal, claiming that immediate disposal might destroy evidence needed for legal proceedings that never actually occurred. This forced contact with her dead child, combined with the knowledge that her baby's death was entirely preventable and caused by profit-motivated neglect, drove her completely insane, creating psychological trauma so severe that she spent her remaining years rocking the empty blanket and singing lullabies to the child who would be murdered by systematic institutional cruelty. The systematic psychological torture was precisely the point, designed to break women so completely that they would never resist authority again, while serving as examples to other women about what awaited those who failed to submit completely to masculine control over their reproductive function and maternal right. What I'm about to reveal will shake you to your core, because it exposes how medieval prisons operated as completely legal human trafficking operations with the full knowledge and participation of church and government authorities who profited directly from the systematic sexual exploitation of female prisoners, while maintaining religious and legal frameworks that made this abuse not only permissible but actually morally required as appropriate punishment for women who had violated social norms. This system represents one of history's most comprehensive examples of institutionalized sexual slavery disguised as criminal justice, with detailed records revealing sophisticated economic structures designed to maximize profit from female suffering while maintaining legal and religious legitimacy that protected perpetrators from any consequences for their crimes. Female prisoners were literally rented out to anyone willing to pay the established prices, with guards maintaining detailed customer lists, scheduling appointments, and collecting fees like they were running legitimate businesses that provided services rather than facilitating systematic rape and abuse of helpless women who had no legal rights or social protection. The pricing structures were sophisticated and reflected medieval market economics, with younger women commanding higher prices than older ones, noble women costing more than peasants, and virgin prisoners representing the most expensive category available to customers seeking specific types of sexual experiences that were unavailable in legitimate commercial contexts. The customer base extended throughout medieval society and included some of its most respectable members, church officials, government administrators, wealthy merchants, visiting foreign dignitaries, and even family members of the prisoners themselves all participated in systems that treated imprisoned women as commercial inventory available for temporary purchase and sexual use. The economic incentives were so powerful that prison guards supplemented their official incomes through these arrangements, often earning more money from sexual trafficking than from their legitimate employment, creating financial motivations that encouraged increasingly brutal treatment of female prisoners who represented valuable assets rather than human beings, deserving basic dignity and protection. Religious authorities played particularly sinister roles in this exploitation, with priests assigned to hear confessions from female prisoners, using the confession process as opportunities for sexual abuse, while claiming that physical examination of women's bodies was necessary to determine the spiritual state of their souls and provide appropriate religious guidance for their moral correction. Women were told that resistance to these examinations proved their continued sinfulness and guaranteed their eternal damnation, while cooperation demonstrated proper penitence that might reduce their suffering in the afterlife, creating impossible psychological frameworks where resistance meant spiritual death and submission meant physical violation. This religious manipulation was particularly devastating because it transformed sexual abuse into religious duty while making complaint or resistance evidence of spiritual corruption that justified additional punishment rather than investigation, or punishment rather than investigation or protection. The confession booth became a site of systematic assault, disguised as spiritual counseling, with priests demanding detailed descriptions of supposed sins while requiring physical services as penance for crimes that were often fabricated or grossly exaggerated to justify the abuse. Save the abuse. Many women developed what we would now recognize as severe dissociative disorders, mentally separating themselves from their bodies during abuse as a survival mechanism that allowed them to endure repeated violation while preserving some core sense of self that might survive the systematic destruction of their dignity and autonomy. Others retreated into complete madness, creating fantasy worlds where their suffering had meaning or where rescue remained possible. Psychological adaptations that helped them survive short-term abuse, but left them permanently damaged and unable to function in normal society if they were ever released from the nightmare of systematic institutional exploitation. The final punishment was perhaps the cruelest of all because it systematically destroyed entire families through economic extraction that profited from human desperation while creating generational poverty that affected dozens of people for every woman actually imprisoned, demonstrating how institutional cruelty could extend far beyond its immediate victims to reshape entire communities through financial exploitation disguised as legitimate administrative fees and necessary services. Medieval prisons operated sophisticated pricing structures designed to extract maximum wealth from anyone seeking to help imprisoned women, with basic necessities like clean water, edible food, and medical attention sold as premium services at prices calculated to bankrupt entire households while providing minimal actual benefit to the prisoners, whose families were being financially destroyed. The psychological manipulation employed in this economic exploitation was masterful and demonstrated sophisticated understanding of family dynamics and emotional vulnerability, with prison administrators deliberately providing just enough hope to keep families paying, while ensuring that actual relief never materialized in ways that might reduce long-term profit potential. Families were told that their imprisoned relatives were suffering terribly and would likely die without additional support that could only be purchased through prison administrators who claimed exclusive access to services that might preserve life and reduce suffering. creating artificial scarcity that drove prices higher while maintaining complete control over both supply and demand in captive markets where desperate families had no alternatives. The services promised were often completely fabricated, existing only on paper as line items that generated revenue without requiring any actual expenditure or effort from prison staff who understood that desperate families would pay for hope, even when hope was deliberately false and designed only to extract maximum financial benefit from human suffering. Desperate families would mortgage their properties, sell their livestock, and borrow money from neighbours to pay for services that were often never actually provided to their imprisoned relatives, creating cascading economic destruction that affected entire communities as productive assets were converted into prison revenue that disappeared without providing any actual benefit to anyone except the institutional perpetrators of this systematic fraud. Guards would continue collecting payments even after prisoners had died, sometimes for months, maintaining elaborate fictional narratives about ongoing treatment and gradual improvement while families bankrupted themselves, paying for services to corpses that had been buried in unmarked graves. Without notification to relatives who continued believing their loved ones might still be saved through additional financial sacrifice. Margaret Whitmore's family exemplifies this horror in devastating detail. They sold their entire farm, their livestock, their household possessions, and even borrowed against their neighbours' properties to pay for promised medical care for their imprisoned daughter, only discovering months later that she had died 3 months earlier, while guards continued collecting payments for her non-existent treatment and fabricating detailed reports about her condition and progress. The systematic nature of this fraud reveals how completely institutional authorities understood family psychology and economic vulnerability, designing extraction systems that maximized profit while destroying multiple generations of productive capacity through transfer of family wealth to prison operators who provided nothing in return except false hope and fabricated progress reports. This system created generational poverty that affected dozens of people for every woman actually imprisoned, destroying entire family lineages while generating massive profits for prison operators who understood that desperate families would pay any price for hope. Even when that hope was completely fabricated and designed solely to facilitate systematic economic exploitation, disguised as legitimate administrative fees and necessary services. These 7 punishments reveal a terrifying truth about human nature and demonstrate how easily entire societies can institutionalize systematic cruelty while maintaining moral self-perception and religious righteousness that allows communities to participate in systematic torture while feeling virtuous about upholding divine law and social order. These weren't random acts of violence committed by individual sadists operating outside social norms, but carefully constructed systems designed to control female behavior through terror while generating massive profits from human suffering through institutionalized exploitation that involved every level of medieval society, from religious authorities to government officials to ordinary citizens who participated as customers, spectators, or financial contributors to systematic oppression disguised as criminal justice. The scale and sophistication of these abuse systems reveal medieval societies' systematic investment in destroying women who dared to step outside their prescribed roles, using legal and religious frameworks to legitimize practices that were fundamentally about power, control, and economic exploitation, while maintaining cultural narratives that portrayed this systematic cruelty as necessary moral correction required by divine law and social order. What makes this history particularly chilling is the deliberate erasure of these experiences from historical records, which represents continuing violence against the memory of women whose suffering was deemed unworthy of documentation or remembrance by authorities who understood that preserving evidence of their crimes might inspire resistance or moral condemnation from future generations who might judge their actions differently. The systematic destruction of documentation and the careful sanitization of historical records reveals how institutional perpetrators of systematic abuse understood the importance of controlling historical narrative to protect their reputations and prevent accountability for crimes that were recognized as morally problematic even by the standards of their own time. Their voices echo across centuries, demanding recognition of their suffering and challenging us to examine how similar patterns of institutional abuse might be operating in our own time under different names and justifications, with modern systems of incarceration, immigration detention, and institutional care potentially replicating many of the same psychological and economic dynamics that made medieval female imprisonment so systematically destructive to human dignity and family structures. Eleanor Cobb, Agnes Hancock, Margot of York, Mary Fletcher, Isabella Worth, Margaret Whitmore, and countless unnamed others whose names were deliberately erased from historical records deserve to be remembered not as footnotes to institutional history or statistics in administrative documents, but as human beings who endured systematic torture while demonstrating remarkable resilience and courage under impossible circumstances designed to destroy every aspect of their humanity, identity, and connection to normal human society. In remembering their stories and refusing to allow their experiences to remain buried in historical silence, we honor their memory and commit ourselves to recognizing and resisting similar patterns of abuse wherever they appear in our contemporary world, ensuring that their suffering was not meaningless and that their courage continues to inspire resistance against oppression in all its forms, whether targeting women, minorities, immigrants, or any other vulnerable population that powerful institutions seek to exploit and control through systematic cruelty disguised as legitimate authority and moral necessity.